Welcome to our discussion on exploring police culture, communities, and well-being. My name is Nadine Jones, and I'm a co-founder of one of the co-founders of the initiative Advancing the Blue and Black Partnership. I am also the immediate past executive director of the organization, and I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing you to our new executive director, Wayne Harris. And Deputy Chief Wayne Harris served over 30 years with the Rochester, New York Police Department. Following his retirement, he founded Comcage Consulting to continue his work of community engagement and to see a world where differences are addressed peacefully and problems are resolved through open dialogue, understanding, and cooperation. He is the current board chair of the Law Enforcement Partnership, LEAP, a former national executive board member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. He's the vice president of the board of directors. He's the vice president and board of directors of MK Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence and a nationally recognized expert on policing in America. Deputy Harris holds certifications in firearms, implicit bias, procedural justice, to name a few. He holds a Bachelor of Science, a certificate in criminal justice education, and he is a graduate of the 244th session of the FBI National Academy. You are all in phenomenal hands with Wayne. He will be your moderator. We feel like we are in phenomenal hands with Wayne at the helm of the initiative, and he will help us to get to the next level. It's all yours, Wayne.
Thank you, Nadine. I appreciate the introduction, and good evening, everyone. I look forward to a good conversation. And I thought we would start by just talking about the why we're having this discussion. And obviously, based on everything that's gone on in the past 18 months, 2 years, even beyond with some of the incidents between the police and the community that have existed here in the United States and abroad for a number of years now, clearly there are some things that we needed to discuss and kind of figure out. One of which happens to be, the concept of officer wellness or mindfulness, or how do we make sure that we are all healthy enough, both physically, emotionally, and psychologically, to go out and do this job and to make sure our communities are as healthy as they can be. So tonight, and I'm glad to see that all of our panelists are here. I was told just a little while ago that one of my former sergeants was going to bring 12 of his students onto the call as well. So I'm really kind of looking forward to that, because I think we can get into a very good, comprehensive and thorough conversation about what it means to consider mindfulness, what it means to consider our mental health, and making sure that we're all as strong as we can possibly be. So I am going to go around our panelists and ask them each to introduce themselves briefly, and then we will get into some questions. And because my mom and father taught me well, I'm going to start with ladies first. So Gina, if you wouldn't mind, please introducing yourself.
Hello, thank you so much, and so happy to have you as the ED. I'm so excited for this. So Gina Rollo White, I have a nonprofit organization called Mindful Junkie, and the goal of the organization is to bring health and wellness to first responders. I teach mindfulness, but specifically strategies on brain, how to cope with what's going on in the environment so that you can have impact on your outcomes, both internally and externally. I've brought this program, Tactical Brain Training, nationwide, coast to coast. I'm predominantly in Alexandria, Virginia, but I teach a lot in California, and I go state by state all the way through, bringing tactical brain training to not just law enforcement, but also to fire services, healthcare workers, but predominantly law enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. I appreciate that. Robert, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the initiative, for the invitation. My name is Rob Cipio. I am the CEO of a 501c3 company, nonprofit here in New Jersey, called Resilient Minds on the Front Lines. Similarly, we do resiliency wellness training, with mindfulness being a part of the overall training. We also do chaplain training. We also do leadership training, resilient leadership training in New Jersey and throughout the country. We administer grants. So one of the grants that we're excited about is through the Burke Foundation to actually train both educators and law enforcement together in ACEs, and actually Handle with Care, which is an initiative that was created by the state of New Jersey. I am a law professor. I'm a lawyer by trade. I'm a law professor. I teach at Widener Law School in Harrisburg. I retired in June of this year, June 1st, and gave myself a whole 13 hours off and then started my new job as CEO. For 25 years, I was in law enforcement as a deputy attorney general and then an assistant attorney general with the New Jersey Office of the Attorney General Division of Criminal Justice. I oversaw, as deputy director, oversaw the financial cybercrime bureaus, oversaw prosecutors' offices, all 21 in the state of New Jersey, on behalf of the Attorney General and the division and the director of the DCJ, all training in the state of New Jersey as well, from academy all the way up to in-service, including something called the Clear Institute. I was an implicit bias trainer, subject matter expert on firearms as well. Ethics liaison officer, chief resiliency officer, oversaw Homeland Security investigations and prosecutions and Bureau of Securities investigations and prosecutions, and from time to time answered the phones and swept the carpets. Pleasure meeting all of you. Look forward to a robust conversation on this issue.
Thank you, Robert. I thought for a moment you were going to say you were retired, and I was going to say you're a busy gentleman for the retirement phase of your life. Chief Norman, Jeff, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
No problem. Good evening, all. I am Chief Norman, or the acting chief right now with the city of Milwaukee, population of approximately 600,000, the department size of approximately 2,400, but 1,700 sworn. Been in the job for over 25 years, big proponent of wellness and resiliency. Understand the importance of it in regards to having healthy officers who are out policing our community. Really big into community engagement, understanding that is a key in regards to having positive relationships between the police department and also our community stakeholders, our elected officials. So really great to be here tonight with you all.
Thank you, sir. And David, last but not least, sir, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, and welcome, Wayne. Great to be here. So I'm David Greenberg. I'm a CEO, a board member, a private equity partner, but tonight my most important role is as a special advisor to a company called LRN, which is the leading ethics and compliance company serving global organizations. And one of our key solutions involves creating training that helps employees both avoid risks and live company values. And we are extremely proud to have partnered with the initiative on an online training experience called Operation Brain Strategies, which is designed to help police officers respond effectively rather than just reacting instinctively when confronted with stress and stressful situations. We are completely committed to the partnership with the initiative, and we hope to be a strategic training partner on many more learning initiatives. So great to be here.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you for all of our panelists. So to all of those that just joined, I see some familiar faces and some that I don't see, but thank you very much for attending this evening. We are very, very happy and honored to have you here with us. So we are going to get into the questions. And Chief, I want to start with you first. And please excuse me if I don't always look at the camera, but I have a series of questions that I want to ask, and I want to sort of be able to look at both screens. So Chief, I want to talk to you a little bit, sir, about protector and savior mentality of law enforcement officers. You know, we've heard an awful lot in our community about guardian versus warrior mentality, but you know, primarily we are trained to be protectors and to help out. And we're wondering whether or not that makes it harder to ask for help. Does it set the tone for law enforcement that they have to be these stoic, very serious, very straightforward charging individuals, or is it possible that the protector savior mentality can kind of get in the way of our well-being?
Absolutely. Understanding that we are type A personalities, even though most of our first responders have type A personalities coming in where when the bullets are flying, you're walking into danger rather than running away from danger. And that particular mentality is can be challenging in regards to showing, I guess, I wouldn't say weakness, but basically you're opening yourself up, being able to speak up when you have, internal hurt or internal trauma. Coming off the police memorial from Washington, D.C., sitting with my officers who have been involved in trauma, losing one of our own in regards to a officer involved incident where one of our own was unfortunately and untimely killed. Speaking with them and talking about how are they dealing with the after effects of losing a partner, being involved in a high risk situation. And there's a lot of begrudging of opening up. I think there's a challenge in regards to having that a level of vulnerability that we need to be able to have where we can decompress, talk it out in regards to our trauma, heal our internal strife, the PTSD. And it takes leaders to be at the point of the spear or the tip of the arrow of being able to not only support it, to encourage it, to model it, being able to embrace that we are human. I always talk to my leadership team in regards to being human to others, meaning your subordinates, because you recognize that we do have shortcomings. And if we're not sound in mind and in body, we are actually going out into the, into the community, half well and not being able to be our best version of ourselves to help others. So definitely being open about this discussion, being supportive, pushing forth the resources, making those resources available, and also encouraging other in leadership, but also, as we all know, there are former leaders and informal leaders. Bringing on people who are, at the line, the front line, who are respected amongst peers, because as much as we might think that we have the authority and the, respect in our respective, formal leadership helms, those who are actually, the informal leaders, the ones who are, in the roll call room, the ones who are looked at as the points of contact when there's an issue on the streets where you're not in that space. Those have that biggest impact in the ability to kind of say, hey, I go see, someone who can, help me through this trauma. I can show that, I understand that we need to, get ourselves not only in physical fit, but also mental and wholeness or spiritually fit. So it's a challenge. I mean, you're coming off, a lot of different, serious situations. I know 2020, I talk it ad nauseum in regards to the challenges of what we dealt with, whether it's the civil unrest, whether it's the uptick in violent crime. But we have to be, again, very communicative, very open, and pushing forth those resources and utilizing themselves, not being afraid to share that, so that we can overcome some of those resistance or feeling, self-conscious or embarrassed, where it's okay to not be okay, and be able to talk about that publicly.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. And I have to say, I agree with you in my capacity. In all the different hats I wear, I have opportunities to speak with people around the country quite regularly. And one of the things I frequently tell them when speaking about policing or speaking about law enforcement is that no one walks away from this job unscathed. No one comes away from a career in policing without being traumatized by the things that we experience on a day-to-day basis, and we carry it with us. And I guess, Gina, I want to go to you real quick. Because policing is unique in that sense, in that we are the witnesses to events that occur on a daily basis, some of which are everyday and I hate to use the word routine, but others that are quite traumatic and that don't just traumatize the individuals involved or the community or neighborhood itself, but also the officers that go. And I guess I'm wondering, what does that day-to-day kind of trauma do to us?
I mean, of course, we all know there's a slow degradation in mental health, which bleeds to physical health. But it's so interesting, that question that you asked in the beginning, which was, is it hard to ask for help? And this is where I see like this connection of mindfulness and intersecting with action. And I think one of the reasons, and I base this on just like talking to a bunch of people and always being in the field and being on the ground with all these officers. And if you ask most people, they would probably tell you they don't even know what trauma feels like. They don't even know what it means to be stressed out. Sometimes when I ask about stress, I'll open up with, hey, you know, what are you guys stressed out about? And I cannot tell you how many times I hear, I'm not stressed out. And we know that you are. We see it on your face. And so I think one of the most important points here is is it hard to ask the question, but how do we know that we've been traumatized? What does that feel like? And then what do we do about it afterwards? And that's the next step, right? It's like, first you have to identify what the trauma looks like. And you know what? It's different for every single person. You know your coworkers, everybody's handling things differently. And it's up to that. We have to teach to internalize it and look within and go, oh, what does trauma feel like for me? And now what can I do about it? How do I even process this, right? Because a lot of times it's like, it just seems out in this weird place, because when you ask, like, what does it do to your system? What does it do to you? It's basically protection. When people are under so much stress, and chronic trauma, we build these walls to protect ourselves. And it's actually pretty beneficial, because if not, everybody would fall apart. Right? And we can't handle everyone falling apart. We need people out there protecting us. You can't fall apart. So these things that we look at and go, oh, trauma, you're traumatized, is actually benefiting the people. But what we have to do is go, okay, you've been protecting yourself and built these walls so you don't fall apart because you're traumatized. But now, how can you work with that? What can we do to get you to go, this is what trauma looks like for me, and these are the tools I can now apply to down-regulate, so that the outside, what people see and how I interact with the world, isn't completely dysregulated and isn't completely disruptive. Both my parents were first responders. And I'll tell you, at the end of the night, when that door was closed, it was all dysregulation. It was messy. It was ugly. And my parents were cool. They were badass, right? But it was still messy and still ugly, because no one gave them tools to deal with the dysregulation, to deal with the trauma. And so on your question initially was, what does that look like? Yeah, sick days, right? Mental health, not asking for help, disassociation. So just completely checking out. How many people do we know that are in law enforcement that are just checked out, right? Just completely non-emotive, blank faces, when there should be emotion there. There should be caring for the people, but it's a way, again, to protect themselves. So we need to figure out how to tap into that and then provide mechanisms to deal with that, so that people can be present, not just for the world, but present for themselves.
Thank you. That's, that brought up an awful lot of thought, for me, having gone through 30 years, little over 30 years of doing this job. So Robert, I'm going to toss something to you. I know how I coped with this, and I have to qualify this because there's some folks on this call that spent an awful lot of time working with me. And I can, and very honestly, I can say that, many of them were my support structure, because, for me, it was helpful to have people that had similar experiences, to have a strong family foundation. But what about those officers, those law enforcement personnel that don't have that? And I guess ultimately my question is it important to have a strong support structure? Does that make a difference in how individuals cope with the trauma that they're experiencing?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Basically, Wayne, what you're talking about is transgenerational trauma that people have. I mean, the way to phrase this, I am my father's son, right? And the effects, the one thing that I think we lose is the fact that we seem to think in the law enforcement community, I ran an academy, that their life starts day one at the academy. That's not the case. It actually, all of what occurred to them, the good, the bad, the traumatic events that took place, we get that person before they even step foot in the academy. And then we have them go through the actual law enforcement experience. And I've seen studies where anywhere from 800 to 1,500 traumatic events on a career of 25 years that officers are facing in that process. A support structure is extremely important when we're talking about that, but also, and the chief talked about it, the ability to be vulnerable, the ability to say, as the chief said, it's okay not to be okay, and being self-aware. The first responder community, law enforcement included, nurses, docs, chaplains, are all wired the same way, which is they're really good at helping everybody else run right towards danger. And they are really, really bad at taking care of themselves. That's across the board. That's a cultural thing that we see. And that's one of the things, right, that we have to change. And so when you have someone with and people who have a strong support structure struggle with that trauma. When you have someone who is isolated and isolating, that confounds the problem because they're not talking with anyone. They're not communicating. I saw a chief out of St. Louis, and he talked about law enforcement and law enforcement basically being trained to look for the wolf everywhere, right? Where's the wolf? Where's the wolf? Where's the wolf? And again, you know, we're talking about a guardian rather than a guardian mentality I want police to develop. One of the reasons why is because when you're looking for danger all the time, when you're looking for the wolf all the time, sometimes you find it in places where it doesn't exist. And that's where you see, right, relationships break down within the community. So when you talk about developing a culture and changing a culture, you have to look at it. From New Jersey, that's what we did with our resiliency program. You have to talk about it just not from the officer's perspective, but with the family as well. And oh, by the way, I realize we're talking about officers and police officers, but the same issues apply to prosecutors who are doing those ICAC cases that are seeing those same images that a detective sees. The administrative staff that's taking those transcripts and listening to the wires and listening to the transcripts and being exposed to all that. It's all encompassing. So I realize we're kind of limiting our discussion to police tonight, but those same stresses, I wanted to make sure those same stresses apply across the board to the law enforcement community, those administrative staff and everyone as well. Extremely, extremely tough when you have someone without those supports. And so, you know, Gina, and we've worked with Gina in the past, and I love listening to Gina talk about what she does and her passion that she brings, right? Programs like mindfulness, programs like resiliency, where the whole goal is to provide officers tools. Bad stuff's going to happen. We're not selling rainbows and sunshine here. Bad stuff's going to happen to people. But when you teach people resiliency and wellness skills, and then you actually teach them the brain science of it, why we're teaching these skills with what we know about the brain at this point, that's when at the very least you give law enforcement officers a fighting chance to actually just not survive a law enforcement profession, but thrive in it. And that's an important concept.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I want to go to David for a moment, but I want to preface my question by saying it's clear that there is a disconnect from the community as they perceive law enforcement officers or police officers. And there are various reasons why this occurs, one of which happens to be the uniform, some of which happens to be what we hear in the media and you know, what we see on television or what we read in books. But I guess I'm wondering, while we recognize that police officers are human beings and part of our communities as well, is there something that we can learn from the private sector? In other words, does private industry address, you know, mindfulness or resilient mind concepts differently than the public sector does? And if so, is there something that we can learn from the private sector to bring into the public sector in order to help out with this equation?
I actually think the corporate world is in the midst of an existential crisis of its own in this regard. You may have been reading about terms like the great attrition or the great quitting. And the polls are showing that 40% of employees right now are thinking about leaving their jobs. So there's certainly a lot of work for the corporate world to do. I think that where corporations are moving has to do with the fact that in the 21st century, the most important effort that comes from employees is discretionary effort. And discretionary effort is very hard to command. It's pretty hard to motivate. You really have to think about inspiring. And how do you inspire people to bring their whole selves to a task or a problem? And that is fundamentally a matter of how do you create the right culture for your people. And when boards ask me, how do we get more focus on influencing the right culture? My first reaction is to laugh, because I say to them, do you have a problem figuring out how to get the right focus on profits or market share or beating the competition? This is a matter of what's a priority, what's talked about, what's measured, and you have to make a goal like health and wellness a fundamental part of the machine that drives an organization forward. There's a machine that drives every organization, and the key is to figure out what the levers are. If you have a program that's on the side, a program of the week, a program of the month, a program of the year, that gets ground up by the machine. So you have to figure out how to make whatever your goal is a fundamental part of the way business work is done every day, a fundamental part of what's talked about, measured, celebrated, what promotions are based on. And so I think there will be lessons from the private sector, but I think frankly, the private sector is having its own crisis here. And there's plenty of warrior mentality and protector mentality in the private sector as well. It's not as extreme, it's not as dangerous as the world of policing and the world of first responders. But there's a lot of pretend in the corporate world as well that, you know, no one has to worry about their mental and physical health. We're all just super women and super men who are capable of anything.
Thank you. So I want to kind of switch gears for a moment, because a moment ago I mentioned something, but I want to expand on it. And I guess this is going to be an open question to all of our panelists, but it's the idea that as a society, there are things like the media, like what we see on television, what we read in books, what we hear in music, you know, what we see in the movies. And I guess I'm wondering, does, you know, the media, whether it's, you know, national news that's on a 24-hour loop, or, you know, other stuff that we enjoy looking at, does that come into play? Does that play a part in the trauma that not just police officers experience, but also our community? So it's open to anyone at this point on the panel.
I'll jump in and just start us off.
Thank you, Gina.
You know, I really believe in the concept of confirmation bias. And so when we have a certain view on things, our Twitter feeds, our Instagram feeds, our every feed we have just reinforces our own, whatever our opinions are. And so I think that's where there's a danger, is that if we feel divisive about X it's just going to be reinforced over and over again. And we're going to feel legitimate about it. And we're going to feel like, yep, that's the way it is. And I don't know how to fix that. I just do see it. And I see it all the time. I see it in my daughters. I see it with people that I work. I can go into a room, into an agency and do a training. And I'll have both sides of the argument there with facts, with people going at it to one another with actual facts that they're holding up on their phones. And so it's dangerous in the sense that if it's something negative, you're just going to keep feeding it, just like you do kindle into a fire. You're just going to build that fire and it's going to explode. And so I'm not sure what the answer is, but I definitely see it everywhere.
Right. And I guess, well, Robert, before you go, I just want to, about a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking in White Plains and I did a presentation on extremism in policing. And one of the things I used was the video from January 6th and the insurrection at the Capitol. And I couldn't help but wonder if seeing that constantly on every channel that you see, whether it's international news or national news, but seeing it constantly and knowing that those law enforcement officers were fighting for their lives. And at the very same time, finding out that some of those people or some of the people in those crowds happen to be law enforcement officers, does the media play a part in this?
Yeah, and look, confirmation bias, implicit biases, all of those. I mean, we're dovetailing Wayne into your ballywick here, right? As a fellow implicit bias trainer, it plays a role, especially that confirmation bias kicking in. I mean, I think what we're seeing, though, especially with the social media platforms and testimony that has recently happened with social media platforms. The media as well is it almost feels, and again, I'm not in the media, so I don't know, it almost feels, and there's some evidence to believe that it's actually being stoked, right? I mean, it's actually being used as a means to gain viewership, or social media platforms to gain viewership as well, which is problematic. I mean, in that process. I mean, there is this, I'm going to put my lawyer hat on for a minute. There is this thing called the First Amendment that obviously applies when we're dealing with this. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a consumer-driven business in that the power that individuals have is turn it off. Obviously, in that process, where do you get your news source from? I mean, people, I actually watch two different channels on the same event. Event happens, I flip between the two channels because I'm really interested in how they're actually covering it, right? And depending on where you are in the spectrum and what the issue is, one news agency is going to go crazy, is going to do this on an infinite loop. The other isn't going to deal with it at all or have their own spin on it, right? And so it's amazing how we are. And unfortunately, this is an example of us being too sequestered. You get your news source from the same thing. You talk to individuals that have similar viewpoints. And by the way, and this is just my own personal viewpoint, I'm not speaking on behalf of Resilient Minds. When's the last time we actually talked with someone rather than yelled at them that have a different point of view? And what about if you talk to someone who has a different point of view that doesn't look like you? When do we do that? And when do we have those discussions? Or it seems to me that everybody's at counterpoint, where we're thinking of the response to retort rather than actually listening to someone. And that listening skill is important. I mean, that's where the context comes in. That's when you did community outreach for 8 years for DCJ, to build relationships, the very first thing that you have to have is a mutual respect, a mutual language, a mutual belief of moving forward. And it does, the way in which we are currently constituted, it does make things much tougher to bridge that gap between law enforcement and the community that they serve, based upon what we see, based upon what's reported. I mean, I'll give you an example of trauma. I know one of the things we talk about is trauma. One of the classes that we had an individual in the class who got a death notification based upon what she saw on CNN. It was actually her mother and father who were killed, and she identified them from her shoes. That has an effect on her, had a tremendous effect on her, and things that we don't even think about. So it's a tough, complex question to answer. Ultimately, the choice that we have individual Rob Sepio, is to not view it, because they are a profit-driven business.
Thank you. Chief, I'm going to ask you the same question, but first Nadine has a question, so I'm going to ask her to chime in.
Well, it pertains to what Rob and what you just talked about. It's actually two questions, and one is applicable to the chief and to David. But my first question is, what are we doing in terms of civilian, the impact on civilians? Rob, you mentioned that it's the entire agency, both sworn officers and civilian staff and court reporters and prosecutors and so forth. There was an incident in Jersey City not that long ago where there was a man who was dangling like a 2-month-old baby, or like a month-old baby, off of a second-story balcony, and Jersey City PD, reasoned and pled with him for, I think, a couple of hours to not drop the baby because he was threatening to throw the baby off of the balcony. And there was a member within the neighborhood who was filming it on his phone. And you can hear him that with every minute that he's watching this, it was a grown man. He was undergoing trauma. Myself, watching the video, I couldn't watch I knew how it ended, which was he did throw the baby, but the police caught and saved the baby, and the baby was unharmed. I knew the ending, and still I could not watch that video. And so I just want us to understand, we're kind of all in this together, undergoing these traumatic events. What can we do? Yes, we want our officers well. Absolutely, we need skills and tools to equip ourselves and equip them to handle what they live day to day. And thank God I wasn't the one who had to witness that firsthand and wonder if that baby was going to be harmed or not, but they underwent. But what do we do with our civilians? How do we get through that?
Chief, I'm going to ask you to answer that question.
Oh, that's fine. One of the things that I'm realizing, especially being in the executive realm, is the work and the lift that we have before us. Having these discussions, especially from the law enforcement community, is still an evolving process. I know that within our own department, we've made some great strides, but coming into this position, I saw the need to have an even bigger lift in regards to understanding the scope of what we're dealing with and what resources need to be utilized. I know that when we have situations at our respective department, making our in-house wellness team available, we have chaplains on staff, we have psychologists on staff, we have a number of different interns and therapists on staff, understanding that it's more than just the sworn. And that's why when I talked about my introductory, we have a department of 2,400 people that's including civilian and sworn. In fact, when I talk about in regards to promotional process, I say that the department and the members of it and sworn is the body, but our civilian is the blood that keeps our respective parts moving. We're all together in this and understanding that we have our own respective levels of trauma, whether you're the civilian dispatcher taking the calls or the telecommunicator, or the individuals working. We have clerks work with our homicide team. They put together case files. They see the photos. They see, and so we have to be more enlightened in regards to understanding what are the needs and lifts, who do we need to include. I know I meet with my wellness team quarterly, just because one of the things that we sometimes are disassociated with being in administration is understanding what's the lift, what the needs are. And if you're not meeting with your wellness team, understanding who is in need. And we have debriefings. We include everyone. We don't just talk about the officers because we're all a team. You can't talk about team and you're not including everyone who's on your respective team. So it's a challenge because sometimes we have to be reminded in regards to that it's beyond just the officer responding to the situation of negotiating in regards to someone wants to commit suicide or seeing, incidents where, someone has been, seriously harmed in a fatal accident. When we have, our civilian staff, being in support capacities, which we would not be able to operate without their support capacity, we have to ensure that they're well also. So being very proactive about it, having individuals remind you in regards to that, it's not just, in camera, this particular group of individuals, and ensuring that we are utilizing the resources that we have available or, bringing in more resources so that individuals are not left out or left behind in regards to having their respective trauma dealt with, and acknowledge that we have those situations within our agency.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. So it is 7:41 and, we have supposedly 19 minutes left. We have scheduled to go a little bit further, if necessary. I want to ask David a question, and then when he's done, I want to open it up to some of our guests and see if anyone has any questions and, open the conversation up a little bit. And I know I can see some of the faces, so I know there's a couple of questions out there. But David, Nadine brought up a good point relative to, civilians. And one of the things that, many of us in the law enforcement industry have been trying to get people to understand for a long time is that we cannot do this job by ourselves. It has to be a collaborative effort between police and the community that we serve in order to, work on those quality of life issues that impact us all. So I guess as it relates to mindfulness or well-being or our just mental health, how do we work together, both law enforcement and the community, to make sure that we're all healthy? How do we get there?
I think there is such a huge gap in the public and the civilian population in understanding the role and the job of being an officer. And the only thing I can really relate to is an incredibly powerful experience I had, and I would love for thousands and thousands of community leaders to have this experience. I happened on a use of force exhibition that was a simulation where everyone had to play the role of an officer under stress, deciding whether to use force or not. And going through that experience was perhaps the biggest teacher I could have ever had in the kind of split-second decisions that an officer has to make and how impossible some of those decisions seem to be. And I just feel like if everyone on both sides of many debates could go through somehow an experience like that, we would have such a more common foundation for discussion. So I just think that so much of the debate between the community and the police lacks any feel on both sides for what the other is experiencing. And, as a part of an organization that does learning, experiential learning is the best kind of learning. And I tell you, the half hour I spent trying to make decisions as a police officer, I could never have learned that through reading, talking, or anything else. So that's all I have to offer. I really do think that somehow the talking past each other has to do with kind of a fundamental lack of appreciation for what the job is. And I'm sure there's a lack of appreciation sometimes on the officer side of what the community is experiencing. but it's just because I'm in the community and not an officer, the spending an hour in an officer's shoes, even in a simulation, was about as powerful a learning experience as I could have had.
You know, thank you for that, because one of the things that we've found, and Chief, I'm sure you can attest to this as well, citizen police academies are designed to do exactly as what you're referring, expose people from our communities to just a snapshot of what policing is, you know, putting them in a use of force simulation, as you described, and there are various different methods to do that, but even just exposing them to some of our policies and procedures, and have them actually take a look at the way we're trained and the concepts that we're trained in. You know, I've had more than I can count people come up to me afterwards and say, listen, thank you, because I really had no idea. So I tend to agree with you. I think education all the way around is going to be hugely beneficial in kind of bridging that gap. And, you know, as it relates to mindfulness, I know earlier we spoke about, you know, people recognizing those men and women in uniform as human beings, subject to the same fears, subject to the same emotions, subject to the same, you know, experiences of trauma that all of us are. You know, I think that's where the answer is going to lie. And this isn't just, that's just Wayne's opinion, but with that, I am going to open it up to the floor and see if there's anyone that wants to share either some experiences of their own or ask a question of some of our distinguished panelists. If you can either use the function in the system or raise your hand, and those of you that worked with me or even for me know that I will pick on someone if I have to pick on someone and get them to ask a question. So any takers first?
I'll go first.
Thank you, Justin. I knew you would.
Yeah. So I have a few questions or comments and just wanted like feedback on it. I have a couple things, but
well, Justin, I'm going to stop. Before you do, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Justin Collins. I'm a Rochester police sergeant. I've been on the job for about 18 years. And in my spare time, I mentor young people from around our community to become police officers. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was with wellness and people that perhaps are exposed to trauma. And, you know, a lot of times, I'm sure we all agree, you can't tell that someone's battling something. It's not obvious. However, there have been numerous situations where I work and in neighboring agencies where we could tell something wasn't right with someone. And they just had this almost like walking around with like a grudge on their shoulders, and their personalities were getting worse. And there were warning signs that, you know, maybe they would get disciplined here and there, but nothing would stick. And then later on, they made an attempt to take their own life. Some were successful, some weren't. And I'm just wondering if there's anybody from around the country or here in this group that knows of any way where officers can alert people to things they're seeing without being feared like they're I guess snitching on someone or feeling ridiculed. But like I said, there's been a few situations where we've had people attempt to take their own lives that are officers, and you could tell something was very off with this person, just very, very angry or just bitter, more than normal.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to ask you to, thank you, Robert. I was going to ask you to answer that one.
Yeah, so I'm going to, Justin, I'm going to talk about it in the context of New Jersey and the resiliency program. So some of the things that we had to do is, in order for law enforcement officers to actually trust and come forward and talk to somebody, is we had to make those communications confidential. So embedded in our policy is confidentiality, except that whatever we have what are called resiliency program officers. Every municipality has one. Every state agency has one. And basically, these are specially trained individuals, not to the level of being peer-to-peer, but specially trained individuals through the resiliency program. And they are literally the guardians of the guardians. They're that go-to person that if you are aware, like, for example, you know of someone that you're concerned about, you would talk to the RPO, and then the RPO would make contact with this person. And it's just like, hey, man, let's get a cup of coffee. Let's talk. What's going on? That communication, if I'm an RPO in the state of New Jersey, is confidential, except for two exceptions. One, if I'm a danger to myself or others, the individual is, then there's a requirement to report. And secondly, because our law enforcement officers serve as an RPO, If the officer admits to a crime in their presence, then they have to do something. So in New Jersey, an RPO is actually trained to explain the two provisions of confidentiality when it has to be breached as well, to let that individual know. So every department has that. So if that happened in New Jersey, and it's really important to have that kind of apparatus, or a peer-to-peer type program, or a chaplain's program, someone there, because we know with a chaplain's program, all of that is specifically confidential, those communications by case law, especially with clergy. So building, right, those awareness, and then also getting rid of that, the culture. You change culture one successful interaction at a time. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time to change that. And so changing that perspective from I'm snitching on someone to I'm helping that person save their life. And I love you, brother. I love you, sister. I'm doing this to help you in that process. That's an important thing. And that confidentiality is really important as well. If we have someone that is suicidal, we have someone that is at boom or post boom, as the terms that we use. They're suicidal ideations, post-traumatic stress disorder, abusing drugs, whatever the case may be. We're then pushing them to a program that we have here in New Jersey called Cop to Cop. And those are specially trained individual, and then we get them into inpatient programming. The thing also you have to be aware of in this process is you have that person and they're struggling, they have to be treated by a culturally competent person, a therapist, culturally competent therapist who works with police officers. You cannot send a police officer to any therapist because of the stresses that law enforcement officers are under. They have to be treated by another individual. Final point, fitness for duty. Fitness for duty saves lives when it's done correctly. In New Jersey, we actually changed the whole fitness for duty process. It saves lives. It saves careers. A fitness for duty. The problem with fitness for duty is it's perceived in the community as being a weapon. Chief doesn't like me, therefore I'm getting a fitness for duty. That and ensuring that it's not weaponized for that purpose, but it actually saves lives. And when we have fitness for duty, and when chiefs tell me, look, I feel guilty with this person, I tell them, Chief, you may save their life. And by the way, when they get better, when they help themselves and they get better, you be the first person to meet that officer back at the precinct and welcome with open arms, give them a hug and tell them, welcome back to the family. I'm glad you got help. That's that process.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert.
I'll also add, we have to have a better grasp of emotional intelligence and understanding how to pick up on those cues. One of the things that I do not tolerate, nor do I accept, is somebody say, I see it coming. That, we're not picking up when we see those type of situations popping up and have the courageousness to intervene or to speak up. And it might be as simple of, is everything okay? And we see what comes out of it. But what we cannot do is ignore it or act like, well, that's his problem or her problem. We all supposed to be each other's keepers, and understand that, again, empowering not only our leadership, but also our informal leaders. We have to be able to look for more than just the sergeant or the captain, whoever, to step up and be. We have to have those who are understanding that we all have a responsibility to look out for one another. And
thank you, sir.
Eyes.
Thank you.
Add one more thing. I need to add something.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you too, Gina. Go ahead.
Okay. Part of this is just like you were just saying, Chief, it's like this emotional intelligence. What we need to do is start training to identify what trauma looks like. It is so sad that I have a lot of the trainings I do are with peer support, because it's just like a group that likes to bring me in. And I cannot tell you, I leave that room identifying people who are in need right that moment. And these are the peer support group themselves. And they're not even talking to one another I just had an incident just last week where someone completely lost his shit, posted all sorts of stuff on social media, and peer support, they had no idea that he was in such bad need right then. And we have to train to identify what this looks like. And that is part of all of this training, this mindfulness training. You know, we think of mindfulness as like, oh, we're going to sit and we're going to meditate, but it's really training awareness. And we're developing our brain. We're training our brain to start identifying what trauma looks like. And that trauma looks so different in each person. But then that next step, which is as important, to do something about it. And that's part of the training that I do, that Robert does, that we go in and we talk about what these look like, and then how it's integral to every step you take to move forward and say, hey, what do you need right now? Right? You identify someone who's in need and just stand next to them. What do you need right now? Right? It's not necessarily sending them away for help. It's just standing next to someone and asking that simple question, you know, what do you need? It's just showing up, and we need to train each other to show up for each other.
Thank you. And I'm gonna come back to this idea here in a moment, but we had a chat question that was placed in the chat that I want to ask David about, and then Chief, maybe you can chime in afterwards. But the question reads, is there any experience in the Police Citizen Academy that gives law enforcement officers the ability to experience life in the shoes of people of color in the community, specifically Black men? So I wanted to ask you about the experience that you had, because I'm assuming it was coming, perhaps I shouldn't assume, but I'm hopeful that it came, you know, from a Citizens Police Academy kind of format.
It actually didn't.
Okay.
It was an exhibition at a museum in Las Vegas, where someone had sponsored a use of force simulation for the public. Anyone could do it. So I don't know if there's more questions embedded in that, or maybe you should go on.
Well, no, I'm gonna ask the same question then to Chief Norman. For the Citizen Police Academy that you've experienced, or that perhaps even Milwaukee runs, is there an opportunity for the community members that take part in that to sort of, you know, walk in the shoes of people of color, or walk in the police officers to kind of walk in the shoes of the community members that they're dealing with?
So it's kind of a tough question to answer. I know that we talk about, you know, fair and impartial policing. We talk about implicit bias. Our Citizen Academy gives as much as the real police community experience. I know we've been doing it for a very long time. I'm glad that was mentioned in this, because sometimes when you talk to law enforcement, we talk about civilian, we think about just our, administrative assistants, things like that, but civilian is also our public that we serve. But in regards to having an actual experience, I don't know if that could be actually replicated. And this is coming from a Black man who wears a uniform, talk about that. I think we can have discussions and look at examples of things that went very wrong. I mean, you can see that George Floyd is a perfect example, but to actually replicate and to basically say this is it, I will be very interested to see what that looks like in regards to having a scenario. I know we do scenarios, I know we do use of force and whatnot, but I know that having discussions and being able to point out the legacy and history of what have been the issues within our respective communities have been very impactful when you overlay it with a actual scenario that we put in our Citizen Academy. So but always open for more inputs and things like that to make things more robust. But coming from my own self, I think it's kind of hard to replicate it. What the situations that our respective communities go through.
So, that was an interesting question. And the reason I asked it, and I'm just going to digress here for a moment, but, when I was working, we had a couple of situations that sort of made it very apparent to us as a department that there was a disconnect between some of the members of our community. And one of the ways we found was to adjust that was to use things like a Citizens Police Academy. But I can recall an incident, and perhaps I see there's two members from RPD here. We had an incident with some folks from Nepal at one point. They're refugees that had been relocated to the Rochester area. And it started very, very simply as, a bunch of kids from Nepal kicking a soccer ball around. They accidentally kicked it over to some guys that were American, and, the American side of this equation picked up the ball and launched it in the opposite direction. Then it turned into a fight. And, part of the problem that we had was that culturally, the people from Nepal really did not trust anyone in uniform, and we didn't know that. We also had no real way to communicate with them. And that, believe it or not, is what eventually became an issue that the Department of Justice ended up getting involved in and coming into Rochester and telling us we had a problem with interacting. We had a problem with engagement as far as those different demographics that were in our community. So I guess I'm wondering, sir, do you find that police academy or citizen police academies can bridge that gap? Or can they be useful to connect with all the different demographics in our communities?
I absolutely think so. I absolutely think there is a deeper understanding of the dynamics, and it explains the why. I'm a big proponent about the why. But I think also we really sharing stories. I think that gives the best impact in regards to the perception of what was the information received to someone who feels affronted or wrong, and explaining that to those and having that dialogue, a true dialogue of understanding. And not saying you got to agree, but at least you understand where this anger or frustration comes from. We don't talk enough to each other. One of the things I push out a lot in regards to having more communication, dialogue, and through the use of, telling your personal story, sharing, and being vulnerable in those circumstances to reveal in regards to what that felt like, how that made you feel, what is your thought process, so we have a better understanding in how to better interact or deal with each other, especially when you talk about cultural values and cues and understanding. And the Citizen Academy will be a safe place for having a dialogue. We do that in regards to, the Citizen Academy, of being able to share your experiences and talk. Trying to replicate it, I think, is a challenge in itself, but I believe that there is a point where you have to have a safe place to have these discussions and truly have dialogue that people are willing to listen.
Thank you, sir.
Wayne, from my perspective, I could just jump in real quick.
Absolutely, Robert.
It's a two-prong attack, right? So Citizens Academy play an absolute important role, right, for citizens to understand police officers and what the job is. But from a law enforcement perspective and what we training, and I can only tell in New Jersey, we've pushed heavily with regards to implicit bias, training prosecutors, assistant prosecutors on implicit bias as well, because it's the prosecutors that are in fact cutting the plea deals, right, with regards to individuals that need to be aware. In New Jersey, all law enforcement officers through something called the CLEAR Institute were required mandatorily to take a course that we created that dealt specifically with the community they serve. And so law enforcement in the Black community, the Muslim community, the Sikh community, right, the Latinx community, the LGBTQ community, all of these things. And basically what we did is brought stakeholders in from those communities and basically asked one fundamental question. Tell me the top 3 things you want law enforcement to know about your community that they don't understand. And from that, we actually created the framework and a platform. So for example, to understand the perception in the Black community of law enforcement, you have to understand history. If you don't understand history, you don't understand that. Where did Rob Scipio learn that? From our stakeholders that told us, if you want to understand, you understand that from a historical standpoint and understand that history. When I trained officers on this and explained to them, look, with regards to police departments, some of the first police departments actually were slave patrols. People didn't understand that. People didn't understand what a sunset town was until we actually talked about them, right? And just having a conversation with them, with interacting with a member of the Sikh community or the Sikh community. The appropriate way is Sikh, actually, is the way in which you pronounce the culture. That in fact, they have a Gurdwara, that in fact, which looks like a knife, and understanding that, right, which is an article of faith and how to deal with that. So all of those things, education and educating officers of all of those cultures, but it's just not, top down, an agency saying, this is what we're going to teach you about the culture, but bringing in all those stakeholders and asking that fundamental question, What do you want law enforcement to understand about your community? What are the myth busters that we need to deal with to start breaking down those barriers and having a conversation? Last point, because I know the lawyers sucking all the oxygen out of the room, is this. With a crisis and any crisis that happens, if you're meeting your stakeholders, your leaders in your community for the first time in a crisis, it's too late. You have to have those communications, those conversations, those kitchen table conversations where you and I get to meet each other and understand that we're human beings and that we all have a common purpose here. You got to have those conversations well in advance of any crisis, because if you try to do it after a crisis, it's already too late. And that's an important thing with outreach.
Excellent. Thank you. So the reason that I wanted to ask that question, it was a great question okay, we have another question coming in. Jeffrey, I see that. I'm going to get to you 1 second. But part of the reason why I wanted to answer that question or ask that question was because that disconnect that we've spoken about already a couple of times this evening only serves to exacerbate the relationship between police officers and the community. And if we're talking about how to lessen the stress or lessen the anxiety that the community feels towards the police, or even police officers feel towards the community, one of the things that's entirely apparent is that we have to figure out, who we are. We have to make that connection that Robert's talking about. So thank you. I appreciate that. It's 8:06. We only have until 8:15. So I'm going to ask this one real quick question. I'm going to ask one person to answer it. It says, do you think that the cultures of policing are identified adequately and formally to officers early in their career to raise awareness of the impact of these cultures? This is from Jeremy Thompson, doctoral student and retired officer, Northern Ireland. Man, Jeffrey, I wish you would ask that question earlier in the night, man, because that's going to be that's going to be quite a conversation, probably in and of itself. And my good friend Sergeant Stefferson chimed in and said, no, they are not.
I agree too. They are not.
And Sergeant Collins is saying, no, they are not. Chief, do you want to add your badge into the mix as to whether or not they are?
We're in a paradigm shift. I will say that the protector warrior has coming on the job back in the day. That was the flavor of the day in regards to coming in and fight crime. And so I think that we are really becoming to awareness, especially after 2020, that we have to really look at how we teach, how we recruit, what are we trying to accomplish, and how can we be better servants to our respective communities. So we are in a paradigm shift. I don't know what the leadership is going to embrace in regards to helping change that culture. 21st policing has been around for years now, and we still have a lot of departments having problems embracing the guardianship or embracing trust and legitimacy, which can make a culture shift of this protection and warrior a hard lift. So I will say that we're being more enlightened, and when we embrace things like wellness, we embrace things in regards to understanding partnerships, because one of the things, and I have to always put this challenge out, we can have all the classes out there, but if you're not ready to receive, if you're not ready to open up and learn, because people shut down, they have their own perceptions, it is a hard charge to change that culture if the right individuals not in the seats of trying to bring in a different paradigm shift of what policing should be now in our 21st century.
Before folks start to log off, I just wanted we have some contact information that we want to share. Also, this discussion is so incredibly powerful, but there's one thing that I would like each of us participating on this call, the panelists and the participants in the audience, what is the one thing that we are going to do? What are we going to implement? What is the one thing that we can implement in order to bridge this divide? Whether it's a case of, as Gina said, we're all in this echo of our own ideas. What can we do to interrupt that? If we are in the police community, what is the one thing that we can do? So the discussion is phenomenal. But yeah, like Rob, the lawyer in me is, let's have some application, right? Let's have some fact application and not just walk away from this with just a discussion, but let's purpose within ourselves to just do one thing differently, big, small. It really doesn't, it does matter, actually. Small or big, it will make a difference. So I also want to share some contact information. I'm going to invite you to take a screenshot or take a picture with your phone. This is if you want to get in touch with Wayne. I also put a little blurb down here. We are trying to get some users in our community portal tool. And so if you are so inclined to take an 8-minute survey just assessing your community, please do so. If you take a picture with your phone, it should work. This is David Greenberg's information, who is absolutely phenomenal and partnered with us from the beginning. And when we thought as an organization that we needed money to keep going, he said, I'm going to give you something better than money. We were skeptical of anything better than money, but he was so right. He gave us LRN and their expertise and their brilliance and their excellence, and we're forever grateful. Gina, this is her information. Take a screen, take a picture with your phone if you want to get in touch with her for Mindful Junkie and her brilliance. And she's also part of the LRN e-module that LRN created with us. And we've got Rob here. If you want to get in touch with Resilient Minds on the forefront, I've heard amazing things in terms of this experience for officers, retired, current, civilians. If I'm not mistaken, Rob, this is also open to community, which I love that you're not insular, but you are touching communities as well, teaching us resilience. Lord knows I need it.
Thank you, Nadine. I appreciate that. I'm going to ask, we have 3 minutes left, so as succinctly as we can, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give a closing statement. So David, you're at the top of my screen. I'm going to start with you, sir.
Yeah, I want to thank you for having us, thank the audience, and I'm much more interested in listening than talking at the moment.
Thank you, sir. Chief?
Just want to share my appreciation of being part of this wonderful panel. I will say that Nadine gave us a charge to say one thing that we'll do to moving forward. I believe in action items. I will say connect. I believe that it's important to always understand there's so many different resources. We have to be open to be able to be lifelong learners and to find new ways to be able to tackle old problems.
Excellent, excellent. Robert, we're going to go to you, sir.
Nadine, thank you for the invite. Wayne, congratulations on your new promotion here. So the one thing, Nadine, extending grace to others, and quite frankly, extending some learning, teaching people to extend some grace to themselves.
And Gina, we're going to give you the final word.
It's so important to meet someone where they're at. And where is that? That requires curiosity. And I feel like it's so important for us to be curious. Why is someone acting the way they're acting? And ask them and be there for their response and listen. And I think each panelist has said that, we need to listen more. We need to be there more for each other. And we need to take action. Like Nadine said, this isn't enough. This conversation isn't enough. We have to leave with an action and do something. And what is that something? It's going to be different for each of us, but be curious and ask the questions.
Excellent. Thank you. So from me, I want to give my most sincere thank you to everyone, for our panelists. I appreciate you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your expertise. To my friends here from Rochester that joined us this evening. Justin, thank you for bringing your troops by. You guys are all very, very appreciated. This is not by any means the last conversation like this that we are going to have. The initiative is going to be holding a lot of events like this, and we're going to encourage you to come back and join us to further this conversation, to keep it going, because quite honestly, guys, this is how we are going to change this equation. having conversations like this, awareness, talking about what's real about this industry, what's real about our communities. That's how we're going to make this change. So please, if you did take a snapshot of the QR code, go to the site, take the 8-minute survey. It will not only will it help us out as far as adding some information into our database that can serve all of our communities, but it will likely give you some insight that you may not have known. So God bless you all. Thank you. Love you to pieces. I appreciate you being here. And listen, we will see everyone next time.